I speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So this is not a complaint, but there's always that but, right? There are like 18 sermons in the readings that we just read. The reading from Isaiah, the Psalm. The Psalm is really good. James is just full of juicy nuggets of truth, right? And then you have this gospel reading, which is, one of the difficult ones, one that really trips people up because Jesus is kind of mean and calls this lady a dog. And so, where do you start? So I'm going to start with recalling to your memory, maybe you never heard this little news item, but do you remember maybe about 8 or 10 years ago, there was it was in the news, this pastor was going to start a new call at a church, and the week before he was supposed to be there, he showed up to the church dressed like a homeless person. Do you remember this? And so he went and got some clothes dirty, and he was wearing dirty clothes and hadn't shaved for a while, and just made his hair look kind of like he hadn't taken a shower in a while, and showed up to church and sort of observed how people treated him. And then the following Sunday, he showed up his first Sunday, and he had notes for people about how they treat people. And I always think of that when I read that part of the letter of James. We were talking last week how James is written by the brother of Jesus, how James is very practical, and you get that in this reading from James. That famous line that faith, it's without works is dead. Faith without works is dead. If you see someone in need and you don't help them, James says, how can you say that you have faith? If you show partiality to rich people and ignore the poor person, or have the poor person sit in the back and invite the rich people to the best seats, how can you say that you have faith? It is this very, very practical, concrete connection between what we believe and what we do. There's that old illustration of a chair, right? You can believe that a chair can hold your weight, and you can believe that a chair is useful for sitting in, but do you really believe it until you actually sit down, right? That's faith in action. And so James invites us to act on our faith in very concrete ways, and in ways that have to do not just with this sort of abstract idea of I believe in Jesus and so I'm going to be a good person in the sort of very general terms. James is inviting us to understand our relationship to wealth, to power dynamics, to socioeconomic concerns. And those things have everything to do with our faith in James's eyes. And we look at the gospel. So let's hold off on James for a second. We look at the gospel. Jesus is traveling outside of his home territory, right? Tyre and Sidon, those cities that are mentioned. Tyre, they're to the north. They're up on the Mediterranean coast, modern day Lebanon, Syria area. And in Jesus' day, Tyre was the economic powerhouse. It was the New York City, the Hong Kong, the London of that region. And you can see in the archaeology, Tyre had the most beautiful palaces. Tyre had the largest amphitheater, hippodrome, sort of think Colosseum kind of thing. There was one of those in Tyre. It was just huge, right? It's this huge, very, very wealthy city. Tyre was one of the only places where this particular purple dye was made. You know that purple is the color of royalty, and the reason why is because it was extremely expensive to create purple dye. They would take these sea snails from the Mediterranean and crush up the shells, and that shell would create this purple dye. And it was incredibly labor intensive, and people had to dive and collect these snails, and it was just extremely expensive to make. Tyre was one of the only places in the entire world that made it. And actually, if you go on YouTube, they still make it in the Mediterranean world. It's pretty cool to see how they make it. And so because of these things, Tyre is this incredibly wealthy area. Jesus comes from the opposite, right? So I said that the archaeology of Tyre shows that it was a very wealthy city. The archaeology of Nazareth is like 5 caves. Jesus came from an incredibly poor background. And so Jesus is very much out of his element here. This is a predominantly Gentile area. He's a Jewish rabbi. It's a very rich area. He's very poor. And he encounters this person across these massive differences, these ethnic differences, right? She's a Phoenician, and Phoenicians, think Philistines, right? If you've read the Old Testament, you know the Philistines are the enemies of the Israelites in the Old Testament. The Phoenicians are seagoing people. They also kind of created our alphabet, so that there's that. Right? But the Israelites are, they don't speak the same language, not even the same language group. Israelites like the desert, Phoenicians like the ocean. They serve other gods. So this is like an oil and water situation on all the different sort of boxes that we would check when we're talking about differences between people. This is it. They're all the boxes. And Jesus has this incredible encounter where, despite the differences, and these are things, I'm trying to give you some context, but we understand the discomfort in this passage, don't we? We live in a world where there are differences. We live in a world where if you go across City Avenue, suddenly it feels like a very different place. We live in a neighborhood where we see certain people walking down the street, and we think, well, they probably don't belong here, right? Have you ever been on those community Facebook pages? Like 95% of the posts are, I saw someone who didn't belong in my neighborhood walking around. And it's got to be one of those differences, right, that sets people off. The other 5% are, I lost my cat, have you seen it? So we understand the discomfort here. And so this woman comes to Jesus and contravening all sorts of things. She's making so many faux pas. She's breaking all of these taboos. And Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, he wasn't supposed to be talking to her. She wasn't supposed to be talking to him. But she comes because of the boldness of her faith. And what does Jesus do? He says, well, you got to feed the children before you feed the dogs, right? And so that, in and of itself, makes us feel very uncomfortable about this passage. So what's going on here? So for one thing, Jesus is turning the script a little bit. The people of Tyre would have been the ones who were feasting at the table, and the people of Galilee, the Jewish people of Galilee, were the ones who would have been picking up the crumbs from their table on a socioeconomic standpoint, right? So Jesus is sort of flipping that. This woman, and interestingly in Tyre, women were very involved in this textile industry. So women themselves were business owners and were very wealthy. And there's a very good chance that this woman herself was a wealthy person. And so Jesus is flipping that script. But what he's doing is he's giving her an opportunity to be bold. He's giving her an opportunity to impress God, which I think is an interesting, the other gospels sort of fill this in. Jesus is impressed by this woman. Jesus is like, wow, look at the faith that this person has who's willing to cross all of these boundaries, to ignore all of these differences because of faith, because of the love that she has for her daughter. And so Jesus is impressed. This woman's daughter is healed, and we're left a little uncomfortable, right? I think all of these passages kind of leave us a little uncomfortable. What are we supposed to do with that? What are we supposed to do with this idea that we need not show favoritism to the wealthy and to the comfortable and to people who maybe look like us or think like us? What are we to do with the fact that maybe loving our neighbor doesn't always mean being nice to them, right? If we're following Jesus' example, there's something underlying love. Jesus has a love for this woman that isn't necessarily tied to propriety or to the way that things are supposed to be done, or those sort of comfortable fake smiles that we put on for our neighbors. Maybe a true neighbor love goes underneath that. Maybe being kind and sort of conventional and putting up barriers between each other and our neighbors, maybe that isn't loving our neighbor. Maybe Jesus was trying to go deeper than that. And so for us, when we consider the differences and the boundaries that we face in our society, when we consider, we're going into this election season and our society, our world, everything seems to be building walls between people. It seems to be dividing people into one camp or another camp. And it feels to me sometimes very hopeless and helpless. Like, what can we do against these forces of division, these forces of hatred that divide people? Remember the boldness of that Syrophoenician woman. She's the hero in the story. The boldness which said, I don't care about the socioeconomic difference. I don't care about the ethnic difference. I don't care about the gender issues that are involved. I'm going to go and I'm going to seek the mercy of God and the healing of God no matter what. That's our call. Our call is to have a boldness of faith that is willing to cross differences, to meet people where they are, to be uncomfortable with people, to go beneath the surface level of niceness and to truly love our neighbors, to show that mercy. And here's a whole nother sermon I'm not even going to get into. But you know that line from James? I mean, this should really make you excited. That line which says, mercy triumphs judgment. Man, that's good news. Mercy triumphs judgment. That is our call, to extend a mercy that goes beyond just niceness, to extend a mercy that can break down the barriers that our society puts up between us and our neighbor. Amen.